Okay, this is CMT206, Construction Estimating, Chapter 13. This is estimates for remodeling. We've talked through the first 12 chapters on new construction, whether it's residential or commercial, um, but we're getting into remodeling and just kind of the caveats associated with doing remodeling work versus new construction. Remodeling is different from new home building in a lot of different ways, obviously. Um, in the the difference being with new construction, you're starting from scratch a lot of times. Blank slate, a lot of times you're involved um, early on, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you have some say in the design, sometimes you don't with new construction. With remodeling, you're typically working a lot closer with the customer. You're not working through architects and engineers and designers and everything else. You're typically working directly with the homeowner or the customer, whoever the customer is. A lot of times you're not going to have drawings. Like with new construction, you start out the project with drawings and specs, and it just seems like everything is laid out for you nice and neat. And in remodeling, you oftentimes don't have drawings to tell you what you're actually doing. And if there are drawings, a lot of times you're going to be creating those drawings, and it may be informal sketches on the back of a napkin, or maybe depending on the size of it, it could be much more organized or detailed. But it's not uncommon for you to be creating your own drawings or sketches to try to just kind of scribble something down to make sure you're on the same page with the customer, the homeowner, what it is that they're wanting or what it is that you're proposing to do. Um, you're dealing with something that's already in place. It's not like new construction where you're starting with a blank slate. You don't know a lot of times what's behind the wall or what's been done before you. You assume that certain construction practices were done, according to code or whatever, but you don't know that. And a lot of times it's behind walls or it's underground or whatever, and you don't really know what you're dealing with until you get into it a lot of time. So a lot of what is required you may be able to see it and physically measure it, but a lot of times you can't because it's concealed. It's either inside a wall, it's under the ground, whatever. So there's just a lot more uncertainty when you're doing remodeling than starting from scratch on a clean slate and getting to go that way. Um, so there's several different ways that you do contracts with remodeling, and they're the same types of contracts, but how we do them in remodeling may be different. There's lump sum contract, cost plus, unit price, same types of contracts, but obviously because different kind of work, you may be contracting the work a little bit different. The most common is still a lump sum contract. If the scope of work is well defined and the owner has no wish to get involved in the construction process, that's probably their best option. Obviously, they can pass the risk on to you with a lump sum contract. You look at it, you give them a price. We agree that I'm going to do this work for this price, and doesn't matter what I have to do to go get the work done, what problems I run into or whatever. This is my price. Um, you have to have a pretty good estimate to make a profit because of the risk involved. You don't always know what you're going to get into until you get into it. So, um, the homeowner, that may be the option, or the customer, that may be the option they'd like to go because they just want to know a fixed price and whether I can afford it or not. Not if you run into some difficulty, the price skyrockets and I'm responsible for that as the client. So, but the same, they're just passing the risk on to you as the builder. So you've got to be very detailed and do your homework before you get involved in that. Um, the other side of that is as you get going, if there's changes, maybe they change their mind or just general changes come up on any project, especially in residential. A lot of times the builder will charge a good bit more. You give them a good price to get the job, but then as these change orders come, and this happens on new construction also, change orders, a lot of times you can make your money. You may have a pretty low margin on your initial price, but when you get into the change orders, you can actually get a good bit more because it's not like they're going to hire somebody else to come in and make that change once they've already got you there doing the work. So from the homeowner side, if they don't know for certain what they're going to do, it's hard to kind of work into a lump sum contract, just because if they're going to be hitting you with a bunch of changes, it's hard for you to price it until you know what's going on there. If there are going to be a bunch of changes, sometimes these cost plus type contracts make more sense. It makes it easier for the builder or it makes it easier for the owner to make changes, because whatever the cost is, you're going to just pay the builder for that cost plus some fee or a markup on that. So it's cost plus 10% or whatever. The builder's in a better position because he doesn't run into something that he doesn't know and end up getting stuck with it. He whatever his cost is covered, and then he makes 10% on top of that. And the homeowner knows that anybody that does it is going to make some profit, so 10% is not unreasonable. So a lot of times they'll just agree to that, so they can have the flexibility to make changes as they go or whatever. Maybe they don't know what they want until they get into it and get through the demo portion. So it says they can even design the thing as it's coming together. They may, as they start to see it come together, decide I want to do this instead of that or whatever. Another option there is called construction management contract, and basically, you're just managing the process at that point. The builder is the construction manager. The homeowner or the client or whoever will hire you to manage the remodel, and they pay you a fee for that, but all the cost of materials, all the cost of paying labor or whatever, they pay those people directly. So if you're just bringing in some subs to do the work, they hire you because you're the expert and you can kind of manage the process and make sure it gets done. They're not a construction person. So they're paying you a certain amount for your expertise, but still they're paying directly for the materials and the subcontract labor that's being used, or even paying your labor to get the project done. There's much less need for all the detail and accuracy on the estimate up front. A lot of times they'll want some kind of price up front, a rough estimate, just to give them an idea how much they're getting into. Can they even afford to do the project? But anyway, or sometimes, the builder may just say it will not exceed this price. Here's the maximum it could cost, and they work on it that way. The next kind of contract is unit price contract. When the amount of work is required is uncertain. If you're going to be digging a lot, trying to dig up some piping or whatever, you don't know how deep it is, how long it is, what the route it runs or whatever, you may just price it by the foot or how deep you have to dig or whatever. So if you don't know how much work it is, you just say X amount per foot, X amount per square foot, whatever, and price it that way. So the builder can quote a series of unit prices and be paid for the actual quantities of work completed multiplied by that price. X amount per foot, X amount per square foot, whatever. So in addition to the cost of the work, unit prices have to include builder's overhead and profit. So when you price it that way, if it's X amount per foot, just make sure that it's enough to work you some profit in there when you're doing that. And then the final thing is a combination contract. And that's just when you may do different pieces of the work under different types of contracts. So the example they give, the builder is paid a lump sum for the main part of the work, unit prices for underground work, and cost plus for any changes. So it's several different kinds of contracts worked all into one thing for the benefit of both parties. So when you start the estimate for a remodeling project, you've got several steps, same way we did with new construction. There's several steps to creating the estimate, but it's basically the same process. You've got to clearly identify all the work to be done. You've got to measure the work to be done, where you do your takeoff, and then you've got to put a price on it. So the big caveats to the identifying the work to be done is it doesn't matter how good you do on the rest of the process. If you don't get a good definition of what the scope of work is, then no amount of whatever you do past this matters. You can do as good of a job with pricing and everything, but if you don't have a good identification of what the work that you're going to do, nothing you can do will improve it from there. And not that you can't recover from it, but it's just very important that you identify what you're dealing with in the very beginning. Good communication is important. Make sure you ask the owner or the client a lot of questions. Use sketches if you have to, draw pictures, make notes, whatever you have to do to get them to understand what it is that you're doing to where you guys are on the same page and get an approval so that there is no unknowns or whatever. And if there are unknowns, then it needs to be noted in the contract or whatever, or try to protect yourself contractually with some different types of contracts or whatever if there's something that you're unsure of or you're not willing to take the risk. Know what's in place before you start. With a remodel, like I said, there's so much that's unseen. It may be behind a wall or whatever. Structurally, you're working with a structure that's already there. So what has to be done to the existing structure to achieve the desired end result? We know what the owner or the client wants. Make sure we understand what we've got to do to get there. It may be that you're taking load-bearing walls out. How are you going to brace that? How are you going to hold it up? Are you going to have to install beams or, there's just a lot of things to be accounted for. You're moving a kitchen around. You may have electrical work that you're not licensed to do electrical work, so you're having to bring in subcontractors. Um, so, anyways, get a good idea of the scope of work, definition of what's got to happen, measure, get takeoff. Same thing we've done in new construction. Get a good takeoff, and then put your pricing on it. Because the scope can be so uncertain, you've got to have a clear outline of what the owner wants, detailed analysis of the existing building, and a detailed plan of what has to be done and how you're going to get there. So again, you may be tearing out part of a building. Know what you're getting into. Make sure we're on the same page with the owner or the client, what it is that they want in the end, and then have a plan for how you're going to get from point A to point B. When we get into measuring the work, this is the quantity takeoff. We did those quantity sheets for the majority of the textbook. Before we ever talked about dollars, we talked about how many of this, how many of that. So we're going to do the same thing, measure the work, same way we've done throughout the rest of the book. The difference is we've never had to do demolition work. So when we talk about doing demolition work, we're talking about a structure that's already there, and there's a good possibility that we're having to tear out some existing stuff to get to where we want to be in the end. So we have to measure from the information that we have available. If we don't have that information available, you may have to specify any assumptions. We assume that once we tear into this wall, there's not going to be any piping, plumbing pipes or whatever. You don't know how the plumber, when they built the building, how they ran their drains. So you assume that it's not. If you've got to get in there and do that, you may have to write something into the contract or into the scope that says if we have to bring in a plumber, extra X amount or whatever. Dust curtains, temporary partitions, and all these other things, need to make sure that those are accounted for. Again, you're possibly working in a residential environment or a commercial environment where somebody lives there or they're doing business there. So there could potentially be some disruptions. You may have to put dust curtains up if you're working in a side of the house where they may be living in the other side of the house and they don't want sheetrock dust flying all through the house or whatever. So just make sure that all of these things are accounted for and the owner is aware of any of those types of disruptions. And on page 266 and 277, they give a very detailed breakdown of step-by-step things that have to be taken account for when doing the demolition work. There's 26 steps. I won't read them off to you, but it's worth looking at because it talks about everything from demolition of concrete, masonry stuff, to wood, finished carpentry, millwork, the whole 9 yards. So it's just worth it to make sure that everything is accounted for when you go to doing the demolition work, because we've talked about how to do the takeoff for everything else. The demolition is the difference in the remodel world, and it's worth just reading through these steps. The actual takeoff. Make lots of sketches, define what's currently there, existing conditions, and what is going to change. A lot of times you'll have a before and after picture or a sketch or whatever. Sometimes you'll take it back to the office and have a draftsman actually draft it up so that you can be very detailed about what's involved. Specification notes are useful to indicate what has been allowed for in the takeoff. If you're making assumptions or whatever, make sure that those notes, make sure all those things are discussed with who the client is so that they know what you're planning to do, what you're allowing for, what you're not allowing for. If there's, like I said, like something like plumbing in a wall that you don't anticipate plumbing to be there or whatever. Um, Make sure the homeowner is on board and understands what work is included and not included in your price. And then it talks about just having a method for your madness. On larger jobs, multiple buildings, it's best to go building by building. Don't have every building on the campus torn apart in some phase. Work through this building and get done and then go to the next building. Or if it's a different, a room by room scenario. But you've got to think about it. They could potentially be using this structure or this building or this, whether it's a house or a commercial, they're doing business. If you're remodeling the entire thing, get a couple rooms done so that they can move out of this place over into the new things, and then you can come behind them and finish. You don't want to just go in there and demo the entire thing and now they have nowhere to work or nowhere to live. So just have a method to how you go through it and try to be accommodating, so that you don't leave them in a mess. It talks about checklists. Use simple checklists to make sure everything's considered for every room on the project. It shows a checklist on page 268. It's nothing super complicated, but it just basically shows you go through and make sure that you're not missing anything. On-site takeoff. A lot of the information that you need for a remodeling or doing a takeoff, you will be able to get from the side of the property that's going to be remodeled. You need to do a site visit, and you should be able to get 90% of the information or more while you're there on site. A good portion of your takeoff can be done right there while you're standing there at the site, leaving only the final calculations and pricing to be completed back at the office. So you should be able to get all your quantity sheets put together and have a good idea of what you're doing before you ever leave there. And then you come back, you may have to look up pricing on some things or whatever, but you shouldn't leave the site with a lot of unknown, unanswered questions. You should be able to get all that information while you're there at the site. Labor and equipment. A lot of the work in remodeling is completed by your own labor. It's not the same as new construction where you may be subbing out a good portion of the work. You're using your own workers for that. So a lot of times you have to calculate unit prices, square foot prices or linear foot prices or whatever, based on anticipated productivity of your workers and equipment they use. We discussed in the last chapter, when you're basing it on anticipated productivity, that's a high risk scenario. You think things are going to go a certain way, but you don't always know that they're going to go a certain way. So just understand that that's a risky scenario, so you have to be careful there. Productivity of your labor or subcontract labor and the equipment depends on the same two factors that we've talked about in other chapters. You've got job specific factors and then labor and management factors. And it's the same things that we've talked about in other things. On job factors, weather conditions, access to and around the work area, the size of the project, complexity of the project, and the location of the job. Like weather conditions, if you're during the rainy season or if you're outside work, landscaping, roofing, anything that's done outside before the building's dried in, it can shut down the job. If it's raining, it affects a roofer or a landscaper different than it affects if you're doing all interior remodel. So just be aware, those types of things that may be affected by the weather if that is part of the project you're working on. It may be that everything's going to be enclosed and inside and you don't have anything to worry about there, but that's a factor to consider. Access to and around the work area. If it's, some of these little garden homes or really tight communities or whatever where you don't have access to be able to get certain types of equipment in there, it's a whole, having the right piece of equipment for the job can make or break you. And if you price it based on having to bring a bucket truck or a crane and then you find out you can't get it in there, now you've all of a sudden got build some scaffold or something that you hadn't anticipated, that's a whole different price. And if it's a lump sum thing, you may not have the flexibility to push some of that price or cost back to the owner. Size of the project: larger jobs are generally more productive than smaller jobs. You get into something repetitious and you can just go and go and go, you guys will get faster and faster and faster at it and get more efficient, and you can pick up speed. Whereas if everything is just a smaller job, custom, whatever, it's hard to really get in a rhythm. Complexity of the task involved: sometimes you got simple things that you can just do over and over 100 times. Sometimes it's every time you do one thing, you got to turn around and look at how am I going to do the next thing. And then location: are we out in the middle of nowhere where we can't just run around the corner to Home Depot? If you can't get materials locally, or if it's going to be an hour run just to go get a box of screws or something, that's worth considering, because those kind of things, leaving the job site and running back and forth to Home Depot, is not making you money. Um, so we talked about job factors, labor and management factors, similar to what we talked about on the new construction side. You got to be aware of these factors and adjust your prices accordingly. Quality of supervision: having a good supervisor on the job to make sure stuff's getting done. You take two rookies out there and leave them on the job with no supervision, and then wonder why nothing got done at the end of the day. So, it's just making sure you've got a good supervisor. Motivation and morale of the workers. If it's a bad work environment, people aren't going to want to work. They're not going to do a very good job for you. Get good tools and equipment. If stuff's old and not maintained and they're having to use junk tools, they're probably not going to do a very good job, and it's going to reflect on motivation and morale, and it just snowballs really quick. And so, experience of supervisors and workers. Again, if you're getting into something you've never done before versus if you've got experienced guys and you've done this same type of work 1,000 times, it completely changes how successful the project's going to be. Um, Labor and equipment productivities. Um, Records from past jobs are the best source of information for how you're going to be able to do. Like if you've remodeled kitchens, or you've built decks on the side of houses or whatever, and you've done that over and over and over, you ought to have a pretty good idea of what it's going to cost you to do that, because you've done it. You should have records. We priced this one at $100 a square foot, but we've done a couple of them and we realize that's a good number, or that we always end up going over. So having your own records is the best way to do it, but also it may be that those records are old. You got to consider wage rates, what it might have been when that price was calculated. So you may have records of the last time you remodeled a kitchen, but it might have been 1985, and you were paying guys $5 an hour, that now you're having to pay $20 an hour. So just because you see the price of what it cost back then, just make sure that what you're paying people and products, materials, whatever, just make sure that those kind of things are accounted for. Just because you've got records don't mean they are necessarily good records. Also, the composition of the crew that did the work. Um, if you had the example they give in the book is, it's completely different if you've got a foreman and two laborers versus one carpenter and four laborers. You may figure out that the crew mix up or whatever, the way you put together crews now is different than the way you put together crews back then or whatever. So, certain people are more expensive, but they may be more cost effective to do it with more people or less people or whatever. So just make sure you're accounting for that. And if you don't have any records, there are published things, RS means and whatever. There's published average labor and material rates and things depending on what kind of work you're doing. It gets very specific for what kind of work you're doing, what part of the country you're in. You can look those up, but again, those are just averages and they don't necessarily mean anything, because an experienced carpenter in Alabama last year might have made X, but if you're going into this project and you have no experience doing that, it doesn't matter how experienced you are as just a general carpenter. If you've never built this particular thing, there's a lot of custom stuff there. So just be aware if you're looking up those general type prices, it may not be as applicable to what you're doing. The other side of that is, as you do the work, keep a summary chart of how you do. Eventually, you will be able to build historic productivity rates so that next time you do a job like that, you can look back and see, how did you do? What did it cost? So here's an example slide. They just show different things on a project that they did. You know, on item 1.1, they had to remove a 1 foot by 2 foot concrete footing. They had a crew A. They've got crew A identified up at the top as one foreman and 2 laborers. They needed a jackhammer, and they were able to do 20 to 24 feet per hour. So having that type of detail lets you be able to roll back to that next time you've got to do that particular task and be able to know kind of sort of what to expect. In the book, they show several pages, 272, 273, 274, 275, of different crews, different tasks, and they just kind of beat this to death. But it is important to have good records for these things so that you can refer back to those next time you're trying to price a similar project. So pricing materials, once we've kind of got the labor and equipment and whatever that we're going to need for the job, we've got materials to figure up, we've got general expenses just like new construction, and then we've got to put it all together and summarize it and put together a formal proposal or whatever. So materials, same thing. You can take your list of materials, can be compiled from the takeoff onto a bill of materials, or recap the labor and equipment onto price sheets like we did elsewhere. So we've put together bill of materials, or we've seen example of a bill of materials, and we've seen example of the price sheets where we took our quantity sheets and applied waste factors and those kind of things and put pricing on it and come up to a final price, or what is it that we're actually going to need to order here. General expenses, they're going to be the same way, similar. It not necessarily going to be the same way, but the same categories and the same general idea of how you go about figuring them up. So it just showed, you remember we had a general expense sheet as a checklist that we used, and we worked through an example on that in, I think, chapter 10. There's an example slide here, and then there's also in the book on page 284 is a general expenses sheet. Here's an example. We've got that in the chapter on general expenses. We've got another example here, but it just shows general expenses for the project. It's a layout. You won't always have every column filled out or every row filled out, but just a reminder, oh yeah, I may have to have an office trailer. I may have to have electricity to a job trailer, or telephone line or whatever, scaffolding, that kind of stuff. So just things that you might need to use. It's good to have a template, and even though you may not fill out most of what's on there, to just be able to refer back to it and make sure everything's covered. And then the estimate is summarized and the bid prepared in accordance with the same thing we discussed in chapter 12. So it shows an example of a good summary on page 285. So this is kind of the final everything for the project. So everything we've done, and it just kind of lays it out, puts your own work, your subcontractor's work, general expense, add-ons for tools and permits and all those things. And so then there's no slides for this, but it actually gets into an example of a remodeling estimate at I guess about the middle of page 276. And the next several pages are kind of just showing everything that we've discussed. 277 is the site survey. We come in here, this is what it looks like right now. So he makes notes of what's there. He kind of does a little, this is what we've got. Down there at the bottom, he shows the cabinets, the dimensions, because he's going to have to take those out or move them or whatever. And so he just gets a good drawing of what is currently there. 278 shows the new drawing. It's basically opened up and they're changed and whatever. So now you've kind of got a before. You've make sure that this is what the owner your guys are going to work off of this drawing, and the owner needs to be just everybody's on the same page. Um, and then he goes through and does a quantity sheet. Same thing we've done on all the other ones. 279 shows a quantity sheet. This is no pricing. He's just discussing quantities of everything that's got to happen. He shows temporary relocate the stove, the dishwasher, the refrigerator. He doesn't say how much or whatever. He just says, I've got one stove to move, one dishwasher to move, one refrigerator to move. He's got the cabinets. He's got the dimensions of each of the cabinets and how many of them, and how many total linear feet of cabinets does he got to rip out. So he just goes through and he gives like a narrative of the whole thing at the bottom of page 276, where it says comments on remodeling takeoff shown in figure 13.6a and 13.6b. He goes through there and shows you how he comes up with everything that he's putting on this quantity sheet on page 279. And then the quantity sheet continues over onto page 280, and then he talks about the recap. So the recap is on page 282. He talks about this on page 281, comments on remodeling recap. He goes through and gives a narrative that describes everything he's doing on the actual sheet on 282. So we won't get into all the details. It's worth it to just look through there and make sure you can follow what he's doing. He talks about in the recap, he goes through and says, okay, I've got to relocate the range. There's one of them, $18. Well, in the description of that, he says, relocating, this is item number 2 on page 1 on 281. Relocating the range and refrigerator consists of just unplugging these appliances and moving them. 2 laborers spending less than half an hour on each should be sufficient time for this. So he bases that on 2 laborers, I can do this, $18, half an hour. So where he comes up with the dollar amount for everything that is on that sheet on page 282 is described on page 281. And then he's able to take that and build it into his final price, which we did the general expenses on page 284, and then his final summary of everything. So he's took all his quantity sheets and his recap and everything that we just looked at, the general expenses, and he puts it into a summary on 285 that has the final thing that is, this is my final bid. This is what I'm giving to the client. So that's the end of chapter 13. It basically takes you through the process of the remodel. The main difference being that you've got demolition work in a remodel. You've priced it similar to the way you do new construction. You go through and look through step by step, have a method, do a quantity takeoff. Don't start getting into pricing until you've got good numbers on everything. Be detailed and get good numbers, because if you don't get good numbers, it doesn't matter what you do after that, you're going to have errors. So that will be the end of chapter 13. And then as we go into, we're just going to skip chapter 14 altogether. It's talks about computer estimating. The software that they're using in chapter 14 is not the same software that we will be using. So I will be recording separate lectures that are not necessarily chapter 14, but they'll be small tutorials on PlanSwift